sit here and just squeeze and do this and train my pelvic floor doing KEGELS and be good?
No.
Why not?
First and foremost, 1 in 3 adults do them wrong.
Dang it.
So, no, don't know about you. I did not have anyone teach me how to do a Kegel. It wasn't until going into the training that I did that we talked about differentiating the contraction into 2 parts.
Okay, let's back up just a second. I kind of jumped ahead. Some people might not even know what a Kegel is. Okay. So what's a Kegel?
A Kegel, or what's commonly known in kind of the media and culture, is a pelvic floor contraction. You'd be surprised how many times I'll try to change the language and say, okay, I want you to do a contraction or pelvic floor contraction for me. And people will look at me with a dumbfounded, like, you want me to do what? And then as soon as I switch to a Kegel, oh, okay, I know what you're talking about. It's like, how is there this disconnect that I said your pelvic floor, I want you to contract it? But for men and women, the cues and the language you use are very different. They've found that for women, being able to say, contract your anus or wink your anus provides a better muscular contraction and strategy than for men. For men, saying shorten the penis or try to lift the testicles generates a better strategy contraction, right? So men are from Mars,
winking
women are from
Venus,
Venus, right?
Winking your anus.
Yeah, so you can't use the same cues, which goes into the learning styles. So maybe you learn best by reading a handout with a picture image for it, or maybe you need different analogies and tactile cues to help you find and feel those muscles. So that's one of the big reasons why, hey, just doing my KEGELS may not cut it. There's also the different contraction types and really diving into different types of exercises for different outcomes in the muscle rehab. So splitting hairs into a concentric contraction versus isometric contraction versus an eccentric. Concentric is more or less when you're shortening the fibers to create a movement. Isometric is contracting the fibers without movement, and then eccentric is contracting the fibers under load while they're lengthening.
So we did like an example with the bicep. So this would be concentric, just holding at the top would be isometric, and resisting the weight, or what's commonly called as the negative, would be the eccentric.
Yeah. And so for the pelvic floor, 10 times out of 10, women or men only practice the concentric and the isometric action of your pelvic floor muscles. They're not really thinking, oh, I should control the lowering down of my muscles as well. And if you think especially in stress urinary incontinence or incontinence when you jump, laugh, pee, run, your pelvic floor is having to control the weight of your organs against gravity. So if you are weak, especially in that eccentric control, it makes sense that that's where you're going to have the most issues. Yeah. And so teaching my clients the difference between the contractions and really creating an emphasis on working the eccentric contraction or the lowering, I've found clinically has kind of been the game changer for most clients. I haven't seen much emphasis in the research on emphasizing that kind of contraction, but that's what kind of makes sense to me.
I've never thought of that as a eccentric control issue, but it totally makes sense. I mean, it totally makes sense, but I've never really thought about that as an eccentric control issue.
Yeah. So being able to use the analogy and difference between don't train your pelvic floor only to be like a light switch where it's either on or it's off. We want to work on the dimmer switch. So having that control to feel the closing of the pelvic floor, and then the really important piece of that lift, be able to hold the lift at the top and then control the lowering down. So it should almost be like a bell curve where you have this increasing intensity of action and then the lowering and tapering off. The other piece is be task specific with the type of pelvic floor contraction you want to use with the activity you're using. So sitting in your car, doing KEGELS to the tempo of your windshield wipers is not going to have you maintain control while doing double unders. So that's where coming back to the learn to crawl before you cartwheel really comes into play, because if you can't find and feel these muscles laying down in a very quiet space, you're not going to be able to find and feel them and then use them while doing a squat. Especially if you have other issues with, say, the pressure from above, as far as the mobility of your thoracic cage and then your breath control.
Okay. So it's not really that when they say, because this is really common now, if you look up this issue, you say, oh, Kegels don't work. It's not that Kegels don't work, they're just not applied properly. Like, it needs to be, it's more than just squeeze, relax, squeeze, relax, squeeze, relax. Like,
Correct.
A, are you squeezing the right muscles in the right direction? B, are you doing it under the right scenario or conditions?
Mm-hmm.
You know, learning to do it in a really unloaded, simple scenario. And then, again, I think people are just taught squeeze, relax, squeeze, relax, squeeze, relax. And then you say, well, double unders isn't squeeze, relax, squeeze, like, it's faster, right? Or a heavy deadlift isn't squeeze, relax at all. It's squeeze and hold. So it's not that the exercise itself isn't right. It's just not applied properly. Is that okay?
And then I also consider being able to understand the modifications correctly to build up to being able to do double unders again, as well as demand on the body when doing certain workouts, right? We talk about, at least in the gym, of not taking your body necessarily to failure in certain instances.
Right.
And so, say if you're doing strict pull-ups in a workout and you have to do a ton of them, right? You don't want to go to muscle failure, so you can't achieve the intent of the workout. You need to scale and modify it accordingly. And so if you're doing a workout that, say, has the combination of running and double unders, right, that's a high demand on your pelvic floor. And if you haven't developed the strength, the endurance, and the motor control to regulate that pressure tension balance, then yeah, you're going to hit muscle failure much earlier.
Yeah.